The Siege of Terra, humanity's darkest hour. The year is the final days of the Horus Heresy, a galaxy-spanning civil war that has torn the Imperium of man asunder. For 7 long years, brother has fought brother, Space Marine has slain Space Marine, and the dream of a united humanity has crumbled into ash and blood. Now, after countless battles across 10,000 worlds, the war has come home. The War Master Horus Lupercal, once the Emperor's most beloved son, now utterly corrupted by the ruinous powers of chaos, has brought his armada to Terra itself. The throne world, the cradle of humanity, the seat of the Emperor's power. What follows is the most desperate, brutal, and apocalyptic battle in human history: the Siege of Terra. The solar system had become a fortress, transformed over decades into the most heavily defended region of space in the galaxy. Saturn's moons bristled with weapon platforms. Jupiter's orbit hosted vast fleet anchorages. Mars, the forge world of the Mechanicum, had become a bastion of military production. And at the heart of it all sat Terra, holy Earth, wrapped in layers of orbital defenses, weapon satellites, and the loyal remnants of the Imperial fleet. The Imperial Palace itself sprawled across the Himalayas and mountains, a continent-sized fortress that had taken the greatest minds of the Imperium centuries to construct. Its walls rose kilometers into the atmosphere, crowned with macro cannons and void shield generators powerful enough to withstand orbital bombardment. Within those walls huddled not just the Emperor and his Praetorian Guard, but billions of refugees, soldiers, administrators, and servants who had nowhere else to flee. The defense of Terra fell to those who had remained loyal. The Imperial Fists Legion, masters of siege warfare, had fortified every approach under the watchful eye of their Primarch, Rogel Dorn. The Blood Angels, led by the noble Sanguinius, held key positions throughout the palace. The White Scars of Jagatai Khan conducted lightning raids against enemy positions. Remnants of other loyal legions, the Ultramarines racing back from the Eastern Fringe, the Dark Angels and Space Wolves fighting their way through the warp storms, were desperately trying to reach Terra, but none knew if they would arrive in time. The Emperor himself had withdrawn to his sanctum deep within the palace, laboring on some great psychic working that none could fully comprehend. His presence felt, but his person absent from the walls that needed him most. Against this stood the full might of the traitor legions. Horus had gathered his forces: the sons of Horus, the Death Guard, the Emperor's children, the World Eaters, the Thousand Sons, the Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, the Word Bearers, and the Alpha Legion. 9 legions of transhuman warriors, each tens of thousands strong, backed by billions of corrupted Imperial army soldiers, twisted Mechanicum war machines, and the demonic hordes of the warp itself. The traitor fleet numbered in the tens of thousands of vessels, from small raiders to massive battleships, and the incomprehensibly vast flagship of the War Master himself, the Vengeful Spirit. Behind this military might stood the 4 Chaos Gods, Khorne, Nurgle, Tsench, and Slaanesh, each pouring their corrupt blessings into the traitor forces, transforming them into something more and less than human. The approach to Terra had been heralded by phenomena that defied natural law. The warp storms that had isolated much of the galaxy intensified, creating a tunnel of relative calm that the traitor fleet could navigate while preventing loyalist reinforcements from arriving. As Horus's armada drew closer, the very nature of reality around Terra began to sicken and warp. The sun appeared diseased, its light taking on a greenish, pustulant quality. Strange visions plagued defenders and civilians alike, nightmares that continued even after waking, whispers in dead languages that spoke of futures too terrible to comprehend. Astropaths died screaming, their minds burned out by the psychic pressure building like a vast wave about to break against the shores of sanity itself. The civilian population of Terra numbered in the quadrillions, packed into hive cities that stretched from the reclaimed oceans to the very edges of the Himalayan plateau. Most would never see the enemy, never fire a shot in their own defense. They would simply die when their hive lost power, when their water was poisoned, when the walls failed and traitor space marines came flooding in. The Imperial administration worked frantically to maintain order, but panic spread like wildfire. Food riots erupted in the lower hives. Cults dedicated to the ruinous powers emerged from hiding, conducting terrorist attacks and sabotage. The Arbites and local militia forces found themselves fighting a war within their own walls even before the first traitor set foot on Terran soil. Families huddled in shelters, clutching whatever weapons they could find. Las guns for the lucky, crude autoguns, or even clubs and knives for most, knowing that if the palace fell, no shelter would save them. Among the defenders, morale teetered on a knife's edge. The Space Marines, those superhuman warriors who knew no fear, looked upon the approaching fleet with something that approached despair. They had fought the traitor legions before, had seen what their fallen brothers had become. They knew that this was not a battle that could be won through martial skill alone. The warp had made the traitors strong in ways that defied conventional warfare. A plague marine of the Death Guard could absorb damage that would fell a dreadnought and continue fighting, his diseased flesh knitting back together even as he advanced. An emperor's child, lost in Slaaneshi excess, could move with such speed and grace that even another Space Marine's enhanced reactions struggled to track him. The demons that would accompany them were worse still, entities of pure malice that could not truly die, only banished back to the warp for a time. Rogel Dorn, Lord of the 7th Legion, had prepared for this moment for years. He had transformed the Imperial Palace into a monument to the art of fortification, creating killing zones, overlapping fields of fire, redundant defense lines, and fallback positions so extensive that even if the outer walls fell, the traitors would face months of grinding urban warfare to reach the Sanctum Imperialis where the Emperor worked. Dorn had calculated the odds with his characteristic stoicism and found them wanting, but he had also calculated that Terra only needed to hold long enough. Reinforcements were coming. Robau Gilliman raced back with the Ultramarines. Layman Russ had broken through the traitor blockades with the Space Wolves. The Dark Angels under Lion L. Johnson were somewhere in the outer system. If Terra could hold, if Dorn could buy enough time, then the traitors might be caught between the defenders and the arriving loyalists and crushed. It was a slim hope, but it was hope nonetheless. Sanguinius stood upon the ultimate gate, the greatest of the palace's entrances. His magnificent wings spread wide as he gazed up at the sky. The Primarch of the Blood Angels was perhaps the most beloved of all the Emperor's sons, beautiful and noble in ways that inspired devotion even among those who had never met him. But Sanguinius carried a terrible burden. He had seen his own death. His precognitive visions had shown him the end, had shown him falling before Horus, had shown him buying with his life the precious seconds that might allow the Emperor to prevail. He had not shared the full extent of these visions with his brothers, had not told them that he knew this siege would be his tomb. Instead, he stood as a beacon of hope, his very presence on the walls worth entire companies of regular troops. When the Blood Angels saw their Gene Father standing defiance, they found courage they did not know they possessed. The waiting was perhaps the worst part. Days passed as the traitor fleet grew larger on the scopes, as the defenders manned their positions and checked their weapons for the 100th time. Civilians prayed to the Emperor in unprecedented numbers, temples overflowing with the faithful seeking solace and finding little. The administratum worked around the clock, trying to coordinate the defense of an entire planet, a logistical nightmare that would have been impossible without centuries of preparation. Food, water, ammunition, medical supplies all had to be distributed to hundreds of thousands of defensive positions. Communications networks were tested and retested. Evacuation routes were drilled. Dorn himself walked the walls, inspecting everything personally, his presence steadying the Imperial Army soldiers who manned many of the positions. These were not the Space Marines, not the superhuman warriors, but ordinary men and women who would nonetheless be expected to hold the line against horrors from beyond reality itself. In the depths of the palace, in the Imperial dungeon, sat Malkador the Sigillite, the Emperor's most trusted advisor and the second most powerful psyker in the Imperium. Ancient beyond measure, Malkador coordinated the psychic defense of Terra, directing the remaining loyalist astropaths and sanctioned psychers in creating barriers in the warp that might slow the daemon tides when they came. It was exhausting work that aged even his immortal frame, but Malkador endured, knowing that if the warp defenses failed, Terra would drown in a tide of daemons before the traitor forces even needed to fire a shot. He also kept a terrible secret, a contingency that he prayed would never need to be enacted, but that he had prepared nonetheless. Something that would cost him everything, but might, just might, buy Terra the time it needed. The traitor fleet, when it finally arrived in force, defied description. Ships beyond counting emerged from the warp at the system's edge, so many that they blotted out the stars themselves. Some were recognizable, battleships and cruisers of standard Imperial construction, bearing the heraldry of traitor legions. Others had been transformed by their passage through the warp, their hulls growing spikes of brass and bone, their corridors twisted into impossible geometries, their machine spirits corrupted into screaming demonic entities. The largest of all was the Vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship, a massive battleship that had once been the pride of the Great Crusade and was now a floating monument to corruption. Its sides had split open to reveal vast galleries where daemons cavorted. Its weapons had been blessed by the dark gods themselves, and on its bridge stood Horus, no longer recognizably human, his body swollen with chaos power, his eyes burning with malevolence, ready to tear down everything his father had built. The opening bombardments began not with the traitor fleet, but with reality itself rebelling against the throne world. The warp roiled and spilled over, its unnatural energies lashing against Terra's psychic defenses. Daemons manifested in the void, gibbering horrors that threw themselves against the Gellerfields of the defending ships. The traitor fleet advanced through the storm as though it were nothing, their vessels already so corrupted that the distinction between real space and the warp had lost meaning. The first shots came from the outer defense platforms, long-range lance strikes and Nova cannon shells that crossed the void at near light speed, catching traitor vessels before they could properly deploy. Dozens of smaller ships died in those opening moments, their reactors breached, their hulls split open to spill their crews into vacuum. But for every ship that died, 10 more pressed forward, and the traitors began to return fire. The void battle that erupted around Terra made the great fleet actions of the Great Crusade look like skirmishes. Hundreds of thousands of vessels on both sides exchanged fire at ranges that stretched from point-blank boarding actions to long-range gunnery duels across millions of kilometers. Fighters and bombers swarmed like angry insects, their numbers so great that they formed clouds visible on tactical displays. Torpedoes the size of hablocks crossed the void, some carrying nothing but explosives, others bearing boarding teams of traitor space marines who would cut their way into a loyalist ship and rampage through its corridors. The loyalist fleet, unnumbered but fighting on home ground with fully stocked magazines and near-perfect coordination, made the traitors pay for every kilometer they advanced. Admiral Su Kassen, commanding from the battle station Magnificence, directed the defense with icy precision, her orders sending squadrons of Imperial Navy vessels into the teeth of the enemy advance, trading ships for time, blood for distance. The orbital defenses of Terra began to fire, adding their weapons to the maelstrom. Massive defense platforms, some as large as cities, unleashed broadsides that could crack a battleship's void shields with a single volley. Missile silos buried in the Himalayan mountains fired surface-to-orbit munitions by the thousand. Laser batteries, hot enough to boil stone, carved glowing lines across the void. But the traitor fleet had come prepared for this defense. The Iron Warriors, masters of siege warfare in their own right, had calculated the optimal approach vectors, the blind spots in the defensive coverage, the weaknesses that could be exploited. Under the direction of Perturabo, the traitor Primarch who had always been jealous of Dorn's reputation, the fleet began to systematically dismantle the outer defenses. Defense platforms died one by one, their reactors detonating in silent flowers of nuclear fire. Weapon satellites were hunted down and destroyed. Slowly, inevitably, the traitor fleet pushed through, and the first assault craft began their descent toward the planet's surface. The atmospheric entry was contested every meter of the way. Interceptors from Terran defense wings threw themselves at the descending traitor forces, firing everything they had before ramming their craft into the larger transports when their ammunition ran dry. Anti-aircraft batteries opened up from the surface, filling the sky with flake, tracer fire, and laser beams. Thousands of traitor craft died in those opening minutes, burning up in the atmosphere or crashing in uncontrolled descents that left massive craters across Terra's surface. But thousands more made it through, and they disgorged their cargoes of corrupted space marines, cultist hordes, corrupted mechanicum war machines, and worse. The ground war for Terra had begun, and it would not end until one side or the other was utterly destroyed. The sky itself seemed to burn, turned an angry red by the fires of descending drop pods and the pyres of crashed ships. On the walls of the Imperial Palace, defenders gripped their weapons tighter and prepared for the storm that was about to break over them. There would be no retreat, no surrender, no mercy. This was the end of everything, and they would meet it standing. The first confirmed sighting of traitor space marines on Terran soil came at the Lion's Gate spaceport, one of the massive orbital facilities that ringed the Imperial Palace. It was a fortress in its own right, capable of servicing entire fleets, with walls that could withstand the impact of orbital debris and weapons that could engage both ground and aerial targets. The defenders, a mixed force of Imperial Fists, Imperial Army Regulars, and Mechanicum Scitawi, had fortified it extensively, turning every hangar into a strongpoint and every corridor into a kill zone. They watched with grim determination as the traitor drop pods began to fall, massive adamantium eggs trailing fire as they plummeted toward the spaceport's landing fields. The impact of the first wave shook the ground like an earthquake, each pod hitting with enough force to create a crater several meters deep. The pod's doors blew open with shaped charges, and out poured the Sons of Horus, the 16th Legion, Horus's own warriors. They had once been the most honored of all the Space Marine legions, the tip of the spear in the Great Crusade, heroes whose names were spoken with reverence. Now they were monsters, their armor repainted in the sickly sea green of Nurgle or the garish colors of Chaos Undivided, their faces twisted into expressions of malice and cruelty. They advanced with the confidence of warriors who had conquered 1,000 worlds, their bolters barking as they laid down suppressing fire. Behind them came more pods, disgorging fresh waves of traitors, World Eater's berserkers already lost in the red fury of Khorne, Emperor's children preening even as they killed, Death Guard plague marines whose very presence spread contagion. The air filled with the distinctive crack of bolt rounds and the screams of the dying. The Imperial fists met them with a wall of fire. Heavy bolters mounted in fortified positions poured rounds into the advancing traitors, each shell designed to penetrate Space Marine armor and detonate inside the target. Las cannons lanced out, their beams capable of cutting through ceramite and the flesh beneath. Missile launchers sent crack warheads screaming toward the traitor positions, detonating among clusters of enemy Space Marines with thunderous roars. For a few moments, it seemed that the defenders might actually hold, that the traitor advance had stalled under the sheer volume of fire. But then the second wave of drop pods arrived, and with them came the Terminators, Space Marines encased in tactical dreadnought armor so thick that small arms fire simply bounced off. These veterans, the elites of the traitor legions, crashed into the Imperial fists' positions like battering rams, their storm bolters and combi weapons cutting down defenders at close range, while their power fists shattered ceramite and plasteel alike. Captain Kamba Diaz of the Imperial Fists coordinated the defense from a command bunker deep within the spaceport structure. A veteran of countless campaigns, he had fought at his Primarch's side since the early days of the Great Crusade, and he knew siege warfare as well as any living warrior. He watched the tactical displays with growing alarm as red icons representing traitor forces multiplied across the maps. They were pushing in from multiple directions, trying to split the defense and create penetrations they could exploit. Kamba Diaz responded by pulling back from the outer landing fields, trading space for time, falling back to prepared positions where his forces could bring more firepower to bear. He ordered the detonation of pre-planted demolition charges, bringing down entire sections of the spaceport's superstructure onto the advancing traitors, buying precious minutes with rubble and fire. The battle for the Lion's Gate became a grinding, brutal affair that would stretch across days. Every corridor was contested, every room fought for. The traitors advanced meter by bloody meter, clearing each defensive position with grenades and flamers, only to find another one waiting deeper in the complex. The Imperial Fists proved why they were considered the masters of defensive warfare, turning every natural choke point into a death trap and making the traitors pay in blood for every centimeter of ground. Barricades constructed from everything from furniture to the corpses of the fallen channeled the attackers into killing zones where Imperial Fists fire teams waited with their bolters ready. Booby traps and mines claimed countless traitor lives. In one particularly brutal engagement, an entire company of World Eaters was lured into a massive hangar that the Imperial Fists then sealed and depressurized, venting the berserkers into space. But the traitors had numbers, and they had the blessings of the Dark Gods. For every one that fell, more arrived from the drop pods that continued to rain down like iron hail. The World Eaters in particular seemed unstoppable, their surgically enhanced aggression driving them forward even when covered in wounds that would kill a normal Space Marine. They carved through defensive positions with their chain axes, which screamed almost as loudly as their wielders, cutting through armor and flesh with equal ease. The Emperor's children moved with unnatural grace, their enhanced senses allowing them to dodge incoming fire with contemptuous ease before they closed to melee range where their swords and claws could work their terrible art. The Death Guards simply endured everything thrown at them, their disease-bloated bodies absorbing damage that should have been lethal, shambling forward through storms of fire that left their armor glowing red-hot. On the third day of the fighting at Lionsgate, the traitors deployed their first truly warp-touched weapons. A breach in reality tore open in the middle of one of the spaceport's main concourses, and through it poured lesser demons of Khorne, bloodletters, entities of pure rage given form, their brass skin hot enough to burn on contact, their hellblades capable of cutting through ceramite as though it were paper. The Imperial Army soldiers who had been holding that sector broke and ran, their minds unable to cope with the ontological horror of creatures that should not exist.
The Imperial fists held firm, their faith in the Emperor and their genetic conditioning allowing them to fight on where mortals would have fled. But even they fell back in the face of this demonic assault.
Cambidiaz ordered his librarians, the Legion's psychic warriors, to the front, and these mighty psychers engaged the demons with powers drawn from the work itself, their minds weaponized against the demonic intrusion. The psychic battle that followed was invisible to most observers, but devastating in its intensity. The Imperial Fist's librarians reached into the Imperium, drawing on their training and their connection to the Emperor to manifest powers that could harm the Neverborn. Smiting lightning arced from their hands, burning demons back into the warp. Psychic barriers shimmered into existence, holding the demon tide at bay. But the warp was not their ally here. It was hostile territory, churned into fury by the Chaos God's attention. One librarian, overpowered by the sheer malevolence pressing against his mind, succumbed and transformed into a portal for even more demons, his body exploding outward in a shower of ichor and warp flame. His brothers were forced to destroy what remained, cutting down the demons that poured from his corpse while mourning his fall. The Emperor had warned against the dangers of the warp, and here those warnings proved prophetic. By the end of the first week, the Lion's Gate spaceport had become a charnel house. The bodies of the dead, both loyalist and traitor, were piled so high in some corridors that combatants had to climb over them to continue fighting. The air was thick with the stench of death, the metallic tang of blood, the acrid smell of burnt propellant and melted armor. Medical facilities were overwhelmed, with injured defenders packed into every available space, while overworked apothecaries and medici staff tried desperately to save as many as they could. Ammunition stocks were running low despite the months of preparation, consumed at a rate that exceeded even the most pessimistic projections. Cambidiaz knew that they could not hold much longer, but he also knew that every hour they held was another hour for Dorn to prepare the palace's inner defenses. The breakthrough came not through superior tactics or overwhelming force, but through treachery that none had anticipated. A section of the spaceport's wall, one that had held against weeks of assault, suddenly collapsed, not from enemy fire, but from demolition charges planted from the inside. In the chaos that followed, it was discovered that a cult dedicated to chaos had been operating within the spaceport's civilian workforce for years, waiting for this moment. The cultists, armed with improvised weapons and suicidal fanaticism, threw themselves at the defenders from behind, while the traitor Space Marines poured through the breach. Caught between two forces, the Imperial Fist's line finally broke. Cambidiaz, seeing that the position was lost, ordered a fighting retreat toward the palace proper, determined to extract as many of his warriors as possible rather than waste them in a futile last stand. The evacuation was a nightmare of running battles and desperate rearguard actions. The Imperial Fists fought their way through corridors packed with fleeing civilians and panicking Imperial Army units, trying to maintain some semblance of order as the traitors pressed close behind. Terminators formed the rearguard, their thick armor allowing them to hold choke points long enough for their brothers to fall back. Many chose to stay behind in hopeless positions, buying time with their lives, selling themselves dearly, but knowing that their sacrifice meant their Gene brothers might reach safety. The roar of bolter fire and the screams of the dying echoed through the spaceport's halls as the defenders fell back toward the palace walls, leaving the Lion's Gate in enemy hands. The traitors had won their first major victory, and the true siege of the Imperial Palace could now begin. As the survivors of Lion's Gate reached the dubious safety of the palace's outer walls, they looked back to see their former stronghold burning. Traitor banners now flew from its towers, the Eye of Horus, the eight-pointed star of Chaos Undivided, the individual symbols of the traitor legions. The spaceport would serve as a staging ground for the next phase of the assault, allowing the traitors to bring down heavier equipment and larger numbers of troops.
Kamba Diaz reported to Rogel Dorn personally, expecting censure for the loss of such a vital position. Instead, Dorn simply nodded and reassigned the captain to another section of the defense. Every position was expected to fall eventually. What mattered was how much time and blood they cost the enemy. The Lion's Gate had bought them weeks. Now the real test would come at the palace walls themselves. The Imperial Palace had been designed to be the ultimate fortress, and now it would face the ultimate test. Its walls stretched for hundreds of kilometers, encircling not just the administrative heart of the Imperium, but entire districts of the old planetary capital. These walls were not simple fortifications. They were layered defenses kilometers thick in places, packed with weapon emplacements, garrison barracks, supply depots, and command bunkers. The most famous sections had names that would become legend. The Ultimate Gate, where Sanguinius made his stand. The Saturnine Wall, where the greatest betrayal and counter-betrayal of the siege would occur. The Eternity Wall spaceport, which would see some of the most vicious close-quarters fighting of the entire war. Each section was a fortress unto itself, capable of independent operation even if cut off from the rest of the defense, designed to continue fighting even after neighboring sections had fallen. The defenders of these walls represented the full diversity of the Imperium's military might. The Imperial Fists held many of the most critical positions, their expertise in defensive warfare making them invaluable. The Blood Angels, known for their skill in both ranged and close combat, held key sections where breaches were most likely. The White Scars, masters of mobile warfare, formed rapid reaction forces ready to plug gaps or counterattack penetrations. The Imperial Army contributed billions of soldiers, men and women who were not augmented supermen, but who were determined to defend their homeworld nonetheless. The Mechanicum deployed everything from humble servitors to mighty titans.
The Custodian Guard, the Emperor's personal bodyguards, and perhaps the most elite warriors in the entire galaxy, held the inner sanctums. And throughout it all moved the Inquisition and the Assassins, hunting for traitors within the walls and conducting precision strikes against enemy commanders. The traitor assault on the walls began with an artillery bombardment that beggared description. The Iron Warriors, with Perturabo himself directing the attack, had deployed thousands of artillery pieces in the ruins surrounding the palace. These ranged from standard Imperial Guard artillery to massive siege guns as large as Titans, weapons that fired shells the size of battle tanks. The bombardment began at dawn on the 37th day of the siege, and it did not stop. Shells screamed through the air in a continuous roar, impacting the palace walls with thunderous detonations. The void shields that protected the palace flared and strobed as they absorbed the kinetic and thermal energy, glowing so brightly that they lit the night sky like a false sun. For days the bombardment continued, millions of shells expended in the attempt to bring down those shields, to crack the walls, to kill the defenders or at least force them into cover where they couldn't return fire. The defenders could do little but endure. Counter-battery fire was ineffective against an enemy who could simply sacrifice artillery pieces without concern, and who had positioned many of his guns in areas where return fire would cause massive civilian casualties. The soldiers manning the walls huddled in their bunkers, the constant thunder of impacts shaking loose dust from ancient stone, the vibrations running through the ground like the footsteps of approaching gods. Those who had to venture out to man weapon positions or conduct repairs did so knowing they might die at any second, erased by a direct hit that would leave nothing but a crater where they had stood. The psychological strain was immense, the constant noise and vibration driving some to madness, but the defenders held because the alternative was unthinkable. On the 40th day, the void shields over a section of the wall near the Lion's Gate failed. The exact cause would never be determined. It might have been cumulative damage from the bombardment, or sabotage, or simply the strain of continuous operation for weeks without maintenance.
Whatever the reason, a section of wall several kilometers long was suddenly exposed to the full fury of the traitor artillery. The results were catastrophic. High explosive shells began to tear into the wall itself, each impact blasting chunks of ferrocrete and plasteel into the air. The defenders scrambled to evacuate the area even as the wall began to crumble under the sustained fire. Within hours, a massive breach had been blown in the palace's outer defenses, and the traitors prepared to exploit it. The assault through the breach was led by the World Eaters, who cared nothing for strategy or tactics, only for the kill. They came in a tide of howling madness, thousands of berserkers charging across the rubble-strewn no-man's land between the traitor lines and the palace walls. The defending Imperial fists and Blood Angels opened fire with everything they had, their bolters and heavy weapons cutting down berserkers by the dozen. But for every one that fell, more pressed forward, driven by their implants and the blessings of Khorne to a fury that knew no fear. They reached the breach and began to climb over the rubble, chain axes revving, already covered in the blood of those who had fallen trying to reach this point. The first berserkers to top the breach were cut down by disciplined fire from the defenders, but more came behind them, and more, until finally they were over the wall and into the killing ground beyond. What followed was close-quarters combat of the most brutal kind imaginable. Chain axes met chain swords, power axes clashed against power fists, bolters fired at ranges where the muzzle blast from one warrior's weapon scorched the armor of his opponent. The World Eaters fought with berserk fury, but the Loyalists fought with discipline and the determination of those defending their home. For every Loyalist who fell, he took traitors with him, spending his life as dearly as possible. The breach became a meat grinder where Space Marines died by the hundreds, their enhanced physiology meaningless against the sheer volume of violence being inflicted. The rubble ran red with blood, both the crimson of baseline humans and the darker shades of the various Space Marine gene lines, and still the battle raged. Captain Raldoran of the Blood Angels, one of the greatest warriors in his legion, led the counterattack into the breach. At his side fought his chosen veterans, warriors who had served since the earliest days of the Great Crusade, each one a master of war. They carved into the World Eaters like a spear, Raldoran's power sword reaping a harvest of traitor lives as he pressed forward. The Blood Angels had always walked a narrow line, their gene sieve giving them both great strength and a terrible flaw, the red thirst, a genetic curse that could drive them into a battle madness not unlike that of the World Eaters themselves. Now, fighting for their lives, many began to succumb to that curse, but rather than curse it, they embraced it, channeling their rage into controlled aggression that tore through the enemy lines. Where the World Eaters fought with mindless fury, the Blood Angels combined that fury with skill and discipline, making them far more deadly. The battle for the breach raged for 3 days without pause. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. The World Eaters continued to pour reinforcements into the fight, but the Loyalists held the high ground and interior positions that negated the traitors' numerical advantage. The fighting spread into the district behind the wall, transforming it into an urban battleground where every building became a fortress and every street a killing ground.
Civilians who had not evacuated were caught in the crossfire, dying in their thousands as stray bolter rounds punched through walls and grenades detonated in residential blocks. The Blood Angels tried to protect them where possible, but their primary duty was to hold the line, and that often meant abandoning civilians to their fate, a decision that haunted every warrior who made it. On the 4th day, Rogel Dorn personally arrived at the breach with reinforcements, a full company of Imperial Fists Terminators and a detachment of Custodian Guard. The Primarch's presence was like a lightning bolt to the defenders' morale. Here was one of the Emperor's own sons, a demigod in his own right, come to stand with them on the wall.
Dorn assessed the situation with his characteristic analytical precision, identified the weak points in both the defense and the enemy assault, and began issuing orders. Within hours, the tide began to turn. The Terminators pushed forward into the breach itself, their Stormbolters laying down a wall of fire that even the World Eaters could not charge through. The Custodians, each one worth 10 Space Marines in combat, formed a golden wedge that drove deep into the traitor lines, their Guardian Spears crackling with disruptive energy fields that could pierce any armor. Dorn himself fought at the forefront, his massive chainsword Storm's teeth carving through World Eaters like wheat before a scythe. A Primarch in combat was something that few mortals ever witnessed and survived. Their speed, their strength, their sheer presence was overwhelming. Dorn moved through the press of combat with economy of motion, never wasting movement, each strike calculated for maximum efficiency. He did not fight with the artistic flair of Fulgrim or the savage joy of Russ. He fought like the fortress master he was, immovable, implacable, destroying everything that came within reach of his blade. The World Eaters, maddened as they were, recognized the threat he posed and tried to swarm him, only to die in droves as his blade rose and fell in a rhythm as steady as a pendulum. The traitors, seeing that the breach was becoming a killing ground for their forces rather than a route into the palace, began to pull back. It was a grudging withdrawal, contested every step of the way, but eventually the last World Eaters fell back beyond the rubble, leaving thousands of their dead behind. The Loyalists had held, but at terrible cost. The breach had consumed 2 full companies of Blood Angels, 3 companies of Imperial Fists, and countless Imperial Army soldiers. The district behind the wall was a ruin, its buildings shattered, its streets filled with debris and bodies. Dorn ordered the breach sealed with prefabricated fortifications and additional troops brought up to hold it, then moved on to the next crisis. There were always more crises, more breaches, more attacks that needed his attention. The pattern established at that first breach would repeat itself hundreds of times across the walls of the Imperial Palace.
The traitors would bombard a section until its shields failed, blow a breach in the wall, then pour their forces through in an attempt to create a penetration deep enough to exploit. The defenders would rush reinforcements to the breach, seal it with their bodies if necessary, then counterattack to throw the enemy back out. It was warfare at its most primitive and brutal. No room for maneuver, no clever flanking attacks, just 2 forces grinding against each other until one side broke. The casualties mounted at a rate that would have ended any normal war within days. But this was not a normal war, and both sides had reserves that seemed inexhaustible. As the siege stretched into its second month, the character of the fighting began to change. The initial shock of the assault had worn off, replaced by a grim determination on both sides. The defenders knew that they were fighting for the very survival of humanity. If Terra fell, the Imperium would shatter and the galaxy would drown in chaos. The traitors knew that they had committed themselves beyond any possibility of redemption. There was no going back now, no possibility of surrender or reconciliation. This was a war of annihilation, and only one side could survive it. The realization lent a desperate intensity to every engagement, no matter how small. The night fighting was particularly terrible. With the sun hidden behind the pall of smoke that hung over Terra, the only illumination came from burning buildings, tracer fire, and the occasional flare. In this darkness, the advantages of Space Marine enhanced vision became critical, allowing them to fight when normal humans would have been blind. The traitors deployed Night Lord squads specifically for these nocturnal assaults, a legion that had always specialized in terror tactics and fighting in the dark. They would infiltrate through no man's land, using the shadows and the cover of bombardments to get close to the walls, then strike at weak points with surgical precision. The defenders countered with their own specialists, White Scar's bikers who could respond quickly to any incursion, and Raven Guard infiltrators who hunted the Night Lords through the ruins.
One of the most effective defensive tactics employed by the Imperial Fists was the use of pre-planned killing zones. Dorn had spent years preparing the palace defenses, and part of that preparation involved identifying areas where attacking forces would naturally concentrate and pre-positioning weapons to cover those areas with overlapping fields of fire. When traitor forces entered these zones, they were hit from multiple directions simultaneously. Heavy bolters from one flank, las cannons from another, missiles from above, mines from below. Some killing zones were so effective that entire companies of traitor space marines were destroyed before they even realized they were in a trap. The Iron Warriors, recognizing these zones for what they were, began to probe with expendable cultist forces first, identifying the kill zones and then trying to suppress or destroy the defending weapons before sending in their space marines. The presence of demons complicated everything.
The barrier between the material and the immaterium had always been thin on Terra, home as it was to the Emperor's psychic might, but the Chaos God's attention had made it paper-thin in places. Demons would manifest without warning, sometimes in the middle of defensive positions, spreading terror and slaughter before they could be contained. The Imperium had weapons designed specifically for fighting demons, blessed ammunition, sanctified blades, psychic wards, but they were not always available where needed. The Imperial Army soldiers in particular suffered terribly when faced with demonic incursions, their las guns and autoguns often ineffective against entities that existed only partially in real space. The Space Marines were more effective, their faith in the Emperor and their mental conditioning giving them some protection, but even they could be overwhelmed by the sheer wrongness of the Neverborn. The Defender's worst nightmare came true when greater demons began to manifest. These were not the lesser demons that had been appearing throughout the siege, but the mightiest servants of the Chaos Gods. Bloodthirsters of Khorne, great unclean ones of Nurgle, lords of change of Tzeentch, keepers of secrets of Slaanesh. Each one was a force of nature unto itself, capable of slaughtering entire companies single-handedly. When a bloodthirster manifested atop the Eternity Wall, it took the combined efforts of 100 Space Marines and 3 custodian guards to banish it, and even then, only after it had killed dozens of defenders. The creature stood 20 meters tall, its brass skin glowing with infernal heat, its great axe cleaving through ceramite armor as though it were cloth. Its roar was a psychic assault that drove mortals mad and caused even Space Marines to falter. Only when a custodian managed to drive his guardian spear through the demon's heart did it finally discorporate, its essence dragged back into the warp. The Mechanicum War that raged parallel to the main siege was equally brutal if less publicized. Mars, the forge world that was supposed to supply the Imperium's war machine, had been split by civil war between those loyal to the Emperor and those who had embraced the Dark Mechanicum. Both sides deployed their war machines on Terra, titans, knights, tanks, and horrors of technology that should never have been built. The Loyalist Mechanicum forces fought desperately to hold their forge vanes within the palace complex, knowing that if they fell, the defenders would lose their ability to repair and maintain their weapons. The Traitor Mechanicum, corrupt and twisted by their pacts with the warp, deployed abominations that blurred the line between machine and demon. Titans possessed by warp entities, tanks that bled, weapons that hungered for souls. The Titan battles were apocalyptic affairs that shook the ground for kilometers around. When an Imperator Titan, a god machine standing 100 meters tall and armed with weapons capable of leveling cities, engaged in combat, entire districts became collateral damage. The first confirmed Titan duel of the siege occurred when the Loyalist Imperator, Dies Irae, faced the traitor warlord Titan Corinthian's Curse near the Lion's Gate. The two machines exchanged fire at a range of several kilometers, their void shields flaring as they absorbed hits from weapons that could vaporize battle tanks. The Corinthians' curse fired first, its plasma annihilator carving a glowing trench across the battlefield as its beams swept toward Dies Irae. The shot splashed against the Imperator's void shields, overloading two of them and causing the massive Titan to stagger. Dies Irae returned fire with its Hellstorm cannon, a weapon that launched shells the size of small buildings. The first shot missed, impacting a ruined hive spire and collapsing it in a shower of debris. The second shot struck true, piercing the warlord's void shields and blasting a crater in its carapace. The battle between these two god machines raged for hours, with neither able to gain a decisive advantage. They circled each other like ancient beasts, their weapons continuously firing, their void shields flickering on and off as they absorbed and shed energy. Around their feet, human combatants fled or died, caught in the crossfire of weapons meant to destroy fortifications and kill other titans. Finally, Dies Irae managed to get a clean shot at the Corinthians' curse's leg joints with its volcano cannon, a laser weapon so powerful its beam was visible as a solid bar of light. The shot burned through the warlord's armor and severed critical supports, causing the massive machine to topple forward. As it fell, its reactor went critical, detonating in a miniature sun that vaporized everything within a kilometer and left a glowing crater that would be visible from orbit for years to come. Dies Irae survived, its armor scorched and half its weapons destroyed, a testament to the resilience of the Imperator-class design. But for every victory like this, there were defeats. The traitor Mechanicum deployed weapons that had been forbidden since the dark age of technology, reality-shredding devices, weapons that aged their targets to dust in seconds, machines that could only be described as technological sorcery. The Loyalists countered with their own forbidden technologies, weapons that had been locked away in the Emperor's vaults, but were now deployed out of sheer desperation. The tech priests on both sides pushed their understanding of machine lore to its absolute limits and beyond, creating weapons and modifications on the fly, many of which were as dangerous to their users as to the enemy. The forges within the palace ran day and night, repairing damaged weapons and armor, manufacturing ammunition, and building new war machines to replace those that had been destroyed. As the siege entered its third month, a strange phenomenon began to occur. The temporal stability of Terra began to fluctuate. In some areas, time seemed to move faster. Defenders would take up positions for what felt like a few hours, only to emerge and find that days had passed. In other areas, time slowed to a crawl. Battles that participants experienced as lasting days were over in moments for outside observers. This was the work of Tzeentch, the chaos god of change, whose demons and mortal servants were manipulating the flow of time itself. The effect was subtle at first, but grew more pronounced as the siege continued, making coordination between different sections of the defense increasingly difficult. Units would be sent to reinforce a position only to arrive too late or too early, because time was no longer flowing consistently across the battlefield. The psychological impact of the siege on the defenders was profound. Even the Space Marines, gene-engineered to know no fear, began to show signs of strain. They had been fighting without rest for months, had watched their brothers die in their hundreds and thousands, had seen horrors that would drive normal humans mad. The Imperial Army soldiers suffered even worse. Many broke under the strain, succumbing to madness, catatonia, or simply giving up and waiting for death to claim them. The commissariat worked overtime to maintain order, executing deserters and cowards. But even they recognized that there was only so much the human mind could endure. The civilians trapped within the palace lived in a state of constant terror, huddling in shelters as the world shook around them, praying to an emperor who seemed to have abandoned them in their darkest hour. And through it all, the emperor remained sequestered in his sanctum, the doors sealed by his own command.
None knew what he labored upon, what great working he was attempting that required his full attention at humanity's darkest hour. Some whispered that he had abandoned them, that he had seen the future and knew all was lost and had retreated to prepare for his own escape. Others maintained faith that their master was working on something that would save them all, some great psychic weapon or ritual that would destroy the traitors and their demonic allies. Malcador knew the truth, or at least part of it, but he kept the Emperor's confidence even as he struggled to maintain the psychic defenses of the palace. The old sigillite was burning himself out, spending his life force like currency to keep the demons at bay. And he knew that when the Emperor finally emerged, he would not survive to see the aftermath. The defenders' situation grew increasingly desperate as supplies began to run low. The palace had been stocked for a long siege, but even those vast stockpiles had limits. Ammunition was being rationed, even for the Space Marines, who found themselves limited to carefully aimed shots rather than the suppressive fire they preferred. Medical supplies were critically short, with wounded having to make do with basic treatment that would have been considered inadequate before the war. Food was still available, but of poor quality and insufficient quantity. Water was strictly rationed. Power was conserved wherever possible, with entire sections of the palace operating in darkness to save energy. The defenders were slowly being ground down, not through direct combat, but through simple attrition. The traitors, while they had their own logistical problems, were less constrained.
They had the entire rest of Terra to draw upon. They simply took what they needed from the conquered territories, enslaving the local populations to serve their needs. The chaos gods themselves provided for their servants in twisted ways. Nurgle's followers no longer needed to eat, their rotting bodies sustained by the plague god's pestilent blessings. Khorne's berserkers fed on violence itself. Slaaneish's devotees found that their enhanced sensations made even the poorest rations seem like a feast. Tsench's followers manipulated probability to always find what they needed. The traitors could afford to spend their forces prodigally because they always had more, while every loss the defenders suffered was irreplaceable. The breaking points came at the Saturnine Wall, in an engagement that would be remembered as one of the most treacherous and dramatic of the entire siege. The Saturnine was one of the most heavily fortified sections of the palace's defenses, a massive wall complex that controlled access to the inner sanctums. It had been designed by Dorn himself as an almost impregnable fortress, with redundant defenses, multiple fallback positions, and enough supplies to hold for years. The traitors had been probing it for weeks, testing its defenses, looking for weaknesses. What they found instead was an opportunity for betrayal that nearly won them the entire siege in a single stroke. The traitors had a secret weapon, a Space Marine Legion that had claimed to be delayed in reaching Terra to aid in its defense, but which had in truth been corrupted by chaos and was waiting for the perfect moments to reveal their treachery. The Alpha Legion, masters of subterfuge and infiltration, had agents throughout the palace's defenses, and they had been waiting for the right moment to strike. They had chosen the Saturnine Wall as the site of their betrayal, calculating that if they could open its gates from within while simultaneously launching a massive external assault, the traitors could pour through and reach the inner palace before the defenders could react. It was a bold plan, and it nearly worked. The assault on the Saturnine Wall began with the usual bombardment, giving the defenders no reason to suspect anything unusual was about to occur. The Iron Warriors' artillery opened up, battering the wall's void shields, while traitor Space Marines assembled in the ruins beyond, preparing for another assault. The defenders, who had repelled dozens of such attacks over the months of the siege, manned their positions with grim efficiency, ready for another day of brutal combat. What they did not know was that hidden among the defending forces were Alpha Legion operatives who had infiltrated weeks earlier, posing as reinforcements from other loyal legions.
These infiltrators had spent weeks preparing, placing explosives in key locations, identifying critical command personnel, waiting for the signal to strike. When the signal came, chaos erupted behind the Saturnine wall. The Alpha Legion infiltrators revealed themselves, opening fire on their supposed comrades, throwing the defense into confusion. Simultaneously, they detonated their placed explosives, destroying key weapon emplacements and creating breaches in the interior walls.
Most critically, a group of infiltrators reached the Saturnine Gate's control mechanisms and began to open them, an act that would allow the traitor forces waiting outside to pour directly into the inner defenses. For a few critical minutes, it seemed that the entire siege was about to turn in the traitors' favor. The defenders, caught completely off guard by this betrayal from within, fell back in confusion, unable to organize an effective response. But Rogel Dorn had not become a master of siege warfare by failing to plan for every contingency, even those that seemed impossible. He had suspected that infiltrators might be present within the palace's defenses. The Alpha Legion's reputation was well known, and he had prepared a response. Hidden throughout the palace were reserve forces that reported only to Dorn himself and a handful of trusted officers, forces that the infiltrators could not have known about because they were kept completely separate from the regular chain of command. When the Alpha Legion made their move, these reserves sprang into action, converging on the Saturnine wall from multiple directions. At the same time, Dorn himself led a strike force of Imperial fists directly to the gate controls, determined to prevent them from being opened at any cost. The battle for the gate controls was desperate and confused, taking place in corridors and chambers where it was impossible to tell friend from foe at a glance. The Alpha Legion had disguised themselves as loyalist space marines, and in the chaos of close combat, this disguise was nearly perfect. Brothers fought brothers, not knowing until the last moment whether they faced friend or foe. The Alpha Legion excelled in this kind of combat. They had trained for it, had made it their specialty, and they took a heavy toll on the loyalists before the tide finally turned. Dorn's arrival was decisive. The Primarch's presence rallied the defenders, and his command ability began to restore order to the chaos. His warriors fought with renewed vigor, pushing back the infiltrators, securing critical positions, and most importantly, preventing the gate from being opened. Outside the wall, the traitor assault had begun in earnest the moment the infiltrators were supposed to have opened the gate. Thousands of traitor space marines and millions of cultist troops charged across no man's land toward the Saturnine wall, expecting to find the gate open and the defenses in chaos. Instead, they found the wall intact and the defenders ready for them. The Iron Warriors, realizing that their plan had failed but committed to the assault nonetheless, threw their full strength at the wall in an attempt to salvage something from the situation. What followed was one of the bloodiest single engagements of the entire siege, a sustained assault that lasted for days and cost both sides tens of thousands of casualties. The traitors managed to create several breaches in the Saturnine wall, and fighting raged across multiple sections simultaneously. In one particularly vicious engagement, a company of Imperial fists held a breach against an entire warband of World Eaters, fighting until every last loyalist was dead, but taking hundreds of traitors with them. In another sector, Blood Angels Assault Marines launched a counterattack directly into the teeth of the traitor advance, their jump packs carrying them over the walls to land among the enemy, where they carved a bloody path through the traitor ranks before being overwhelmed. The custodian guards deployed in force, their golden armor soon stained red with traitor blood as they held key positions against impossible odds. The most significant action at the Saturnine wall involved Sanguinius himself. The Primarch of the Blood Angels had been held in reserve, his prescient visions telling him that he would be needed at a critical moment. When he saw the scale of the traitor assault on the Saturnine wall, he knew that moment had come.
Taking flight on his magnificent wings, he soared over the battlefield toward the heaviest fighting, an angel of death descending upon the traitors. His arrival was like a thunderbolt. Wielding the blade in Carmine, a master-crafted power sword that had been forged specifically for him, Sanguinius crashed into the traitor lines with devastating force. He fought with a grace and skill that made even other Primarchs seem clumsy by comparison, his sword weaving patterns of death through the air, his wings carrying him from one engagement to another with impossible speed. Wherever Sanguinius appeared, the traitors fell back. Even the most corrupted Chaos Space Marines felt something primal in their still human hearts when they beheld him, a recognition of what they had lost when they turned from the Emperor's light. The Primarch fought for hours, never tiring, never slowing, his blade reaping a harvest of traitor lives that numbered in the hundreds. He destroyed 2 Chaos Titans almost single-handedly, tearing apart their void shields with psychic might before flying to their heads and driving his sword through their cockpits. He banished a greater daemon of Khorne, standing alone against the towering horror and outdueling it in single combat before the blessed blade finally sent it screaming back to the warp. His presence transformed the defense. Where he stood, the Loyalists rallied and counterattacked with renewed vigor, pushing the traitors back from the breaches they had created. But even a Primarch could not be everywhere at once, and the scale of the assault was simply too vast. The traitors managed to establish a foothold within the Saturnine Wall's outer defenses, creating a salient that pushed deep into the Loyalist positions. Dorn, recognizing the danger, made the difficult decision to abandon the outer sections of the Saturnine Wall and fall back to interior defensive lines that he had prepared for exactly this contingency. It was a calculated retreat, trading space for time, but it meant surrendering positions that had cost thousands of lives to defend. The withdrawal was conducted with Imperial Fist's precision, each unit falling back in order, maintaining formation even under intense pressure from the pursuing traitors. The Alpha Legion infiltrators who had survived the initial fighting were hunted down and destroyed in the chaos of the retreat, their deception no longer useful once it had been revealed. The aftermath of the Saturnine Wall battle saw the defenders in a precarious position. They had held, but barely, and only by sacrificing significant ground. The traitors now controlled the outer sections of one of the palace's most important defensive positions, putting them in striking distance of the inner sanctums. Casualty figures were staggering, tens of thousands dead on both sides, entire companies of Space Marines wiped out, irreplaceable war machines destroyed. The defenders' morale, already strained to the breaking point, began to crack. Even among the Space Marines, there were whispers of despair, questions about how much longer they could hold. The human defenders were worse. Some units had to be disbanded entirely after their soldiers simply gave up, sitting down in the trenches and refusing to fight any longer. Rogel Dorn called a war council after the Saturnine Wall action, gathering his fellow commanders to assess the situation. Sanguinius attended, as did representatives from the White Scars, the Imperial Army High Command, the Mechanicum, and the Custodian Guard. The situation they assessed was grim. They had been fighting for 4 months, had lost approximately 40% of their initial defending force, and were running critically low on supplies. The traitors showed no signs of letting up their assault. If anything, they seemed to be intensifying their efforts. The psychic pressure was growing worse by the day, with demon manifestations becoming more frequent and more powerful. And there was still no sign of the relief force that had been promised. Gilliman and the Ultramarines, Russ and the Space Wolves, the Lion and the Dark Angels, all were still fighting their way through the warp storms that separated them from Terra. The Council debated their options. Some argued for a desperate breakout attempt, trying to punch through the traitor lines and escape to regroup elsewhere. This was quickly dismissed. There was nowhere to escape to, and abandoning Terra would mean abandoning the Emperor himself. Others suggested they attempt to negotiate, to buy time by offering concessions. This too was rejected. There could be no negotiation with chaos, no middle ground between loyalty and damnation. In the end, they came back to the only real option they had. They would continue to hold, would continue to make the traitors pay for every meter of ground, would trust that the emperor knew what he was doing in his sanctum, and that relief would arrive before the last wall fell. It was not much of a plan, but it was all they had. As the siege entered its 5th month, something began to change in the character of the traitor assault. Where before they had been pressing hard on every front, trying to overwhelm the defenders through sheer weight of numbers, now they began to concentrate their efforts on specific sections of the wall.
Perturabo, the master of siege warfare, had been studying the defense in detail, looking for its weak points, and he believed he had found them. The Eternity Wall spaceport, one of the major defensive positions, was now the focus of a systematic, sustained assault that made all previous fighting look like minor skirmishes by comparison. The Iron Warriors, Perturabo's own legion, took the lead, supported by the Death Guard and elements of the Sons of Horus. They came not in wild charges, but in carefully orchestrated waves, each one probing the defenses, gathering intelligence, preparing for the next assault. The defenders of the Eternity Wall knew they were in for the fight of their lives. The spaceport was critical to the defense. If it fell, the traitors would have a clear path to the inner palace and could bring down heavy equipment and reinforcements much faster than the defenders could counter. The Space Marines manning the position were a mixed force. Imperial fists formed the core, but there were also significant elements of Blood Angels, White Scars, and even a few custodians. Behind them stood thousands of Imperial Army soldiers, Skitari, and armed civilians who had volunteered to fight. They prepared their defenses as best they could, reinforcing positions, pre-positioning ammunition, setting up aid stations, and saying their prayers to the Emperor. The assault, when it came, was methodical and terrifying in its efficiency. The Iron Warriors advanced behind a creeping barrage of artillery fire that rolled across the spaceport like a wave of death, systematically destroying defensive positions. Behind the barrage came the Space Marines, advancing in tight formation, their heavy weapons teams providing covering fire while assault squads moved forward to engage any defenders who survived the bombardment. When they encountered a strong point, they would call in support. Artillery strikes, airstrikes from corrupted stormbirds, even orbital bombardment from the traitor fleet in orbit. They took their time, never rushing, never leaving bypass positions to threaten their flanks. It was siege warfare as an art form, and it was brutally effective. The defenders tried every tactic they knew. They launched counterattacks to disrupt the Iron Warriors' advance, but these were met with such overwhelming firepower that they accomplished little beyond adding to the casualty count. They tried to bring down the traitor artillery with counter-battery fire, but the Iron Warriors had dispersed their guns too widely and protected them too well. They called in their own air support, but the traitor air defense was so thick that most Imperial aircraft were shot down before they could deliver their payloads. Slowly, inexorably, the Iron Warriors ground forward, taking the Eternity Wall spaceport apart piece by piece. The fighting inside the spaceport was apocalyptic. Entire hangar bays became battlegrounds where hundreds died in minutes. The Iron Warriors deployed Terminator squads to lead assaults on fortified positions. These veterans in tactical dreadnought armor, virtually immune to small arms fire, and capable of smashing through most obstacles through brute force. The defenders responded by concentrating their anti-armor weapons on these squads, las cannon teams, and missile launcher operators targeting the Terminators specifically, trading their lives to take down each one.
In one memorable action, a single Imperial Fist's Devastator squad held a crucial choke point against an entire company of Iron Warriors, their heavy bolters and las cannons cutting down traitors for over an hour before they were finally overwhelmed. When the Iron Warriors finally breached their position, they found all 6 defenders dead at their guns, surrounded by dozens of traitor corpses. The arrival of Perturobo himself marked the beginning of the end for the Eternity Wall. The Primarch of the Iron Warriors was a strategic genius, but also a being of tremendous personal power, and when he finally committed himself to the battle, the result was devastating. He advanced at the head of his trident, his 3 most trusted subordinates, their elite Terminators forming an armored wedge that nothing could stop. Perturobo wielded Forgebreaker, a massive thunderhammer that had been a gift from his traitorous brother Fulgrim, and with it he smashed through defensive positions that had held against everything else the traitors had thrown at them. Bunkers designed to withstand orbital bombardment collapsed under his assault. Blast doors 3 meters thick were torn from their hinges. Any defender brave or foolish enough to stand before him was reduced to paste. The Imperial Fist's defenders knew they could not stand against a Primarch without one of their own to counter him. They called for Rogel Dorn, their Gene Father, to come and face his traitorous brother. The 2 Primarchs had always had a complicated relationship. They were both masters of siege warfare, but where Dorn built to endure, Perturobo built to crush. The rivalry had been professional before the heresy, but now it was personal and deadly. Dorn came to the Eternity Wall with all the speed he could muster, taking only a small honor guard with him because time was critical. The 2 Primarchs met in the ruins of what had once been the spaceport's main transit hub, and there they fought while armies clashed around them. The duel between Dorn and Perturobo was everything one would expect from 2 demigods dedicated to the art of war. They fought with weapons that could crack battle tanks, each blow struck with enough force to shatter stone. Dorn fought with disciplined fury, his chainsword Storm's Teeth screaming as it carved toward his brother. Perturobo countered with Forgebreaker, each swing of the hammer creating shockwaves that knocked nearby combatants off their feet. The 2 were evenly matched. Dorn was perhaps the better swordsman, but Perturobo's rage gave him strength. They traded blows that would have killed any lesser being, their Primarch physiology allowing them to fight on through injuries that would have crippled even a Space Marine. The duel raged for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes. Around them, the battle continued, Imperial Fists trying to push back the Iron Warriors while protecting their Primarch, the traitors doing the same for theirs.
In the end, neither Primarch could gain a decisive advantage over the other. Dorn managed to land a blow that cracked Perturbo's armor and drew blood, but Perturbo countered with a hammer strike that shattered Dorn's right pauldron and dislocated his shoulder. Both Primarchs were breathing heavily, wounded but far from defeated, when the strategic situation forced them to break off. The Eternity Wall was collapsing. The Iron Warriors had achieved breakthrough in several locations and were pouring into the interior positions. Dorn had to fall back to organize the retreat or risk being cut off and surrounded. Perturbo let him go, more interested in claiming the spaceport than in pursuing a wounded brother. The loss of the Eternity Wall spaceport was a devastating blow to the defenders. It was the second major position they had lost, and it put the traitors in an even better position to assault the Inner Palace. More importantly, it demonstrated that the defensive lines that Dorn had worked so hard to create could be breached, that the traitors had the capability and the will to grind through whatever the loyalists threw at them. The mood within the palace grew darker still. Many began to believe that this was truly the end, that the Emperor had abandoned them, that they were simply delaying the inevitable rather than actually defending their homeworld. But even in this darkest hour, there were moments of heroism that inspired the defenders to keep fighting.
At the Colossus Gate, a mixed force of Blood Angels and White Scars held against a sustained assault by the Emperor's children for 3 full days without relief or resupply, eventually forcing the traitors to withdraw after inflicting such heavy casualties that the enemy legion needed to pull back and regroup. At the Mercury Wall, a company of Custodian Guard under the command of Constantine Valdor, the Captain General of the Custodes, conducted a daring raid deep into traitor-held territory, destroying a major ammunition dump and killing a traitor war leader before extracting back to friendly lines with minimal losses. These victories were small in the grand scheme of the siege, but they proved that the traitors were not invincible, that the defenders could still hurt them, that the fight was not yet over. The civilian population within the palace, meanwhile, had descended into a hellish existence that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. They lived in overcrowded shelters with inadequate food, water, and sanitation. Disease was rampant. Typhus, cholera, and worse spread through the refugee camps like wildfire. The dead could not be properly disposed of, creating health hazards that compounded the misery. Children cried from hunger, their parents unable to feed them. Some parents making the terrible decision to euthanize their children rather than let them starve slowly. The old and infirm simply gave up, lying down to die, their bodies left where they fell because there was no one with the time or energy to move them. And through it all, the constant thunder of battle shook the ground, a reminder that their suffering could end at any moment when the walls finally failed and the traitors came flooding in. Yet even here, humanity showed its resilience. Volunteer groups organized within the shelters to care for the wounded and sick. Teachers continued to hold classes for children, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy in the midst of apocalypse. Religious leaders of various faiths held services, though increasingly these were centered on the imperial cult and worship of the emperor as a god, a development that would have troubled the emperor himself, who had always denied his divinity, but which gave the suffering masses something to cling to in their darkest hours. Some civilians even volunteered to fight, taking up whatever weapons they could find and manning secondary defensive positions, knowing they would likely die, but determined to contribute something to the defense of their world. The Mechanicum's forges within the palace were working beyond their rated capacity, pushed to breaking point and beyond. The tech priests had abandoned most safety protocols in their desperate effort to keep the defenders supplied. Servitors worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, their bionic components failing under the strain. Forge vanes that should have been shut down for maintenance every few weeks had been running continuously for months, their machine spirits growing temperamental and dangerous. Accidents were common, plasma reactors overloading, manufacturum collapses, chemical fires that consumed entire facilities. But still, the forges produced, turning out ammunition, spare parts, new weapons, anything the defenders needed. The tech priests themselves had become gaunt and hollow-eyed, many sustained only by cybernetic augmentation and combat stimulants, their humanity slowly being replaced by machine as they literally worked themselves to death in service of the Omnici. As the siege entered its 6th month, the nature of the warp incursions changed. Where before the daemon manifestations had been somewhat random, appearing wherever the barrier between realms grew thin, now they began to follow patterns that suggested deliberate coordination. The Chaos Gods were focusing their attention on Terra with an intensity that had never been seen before, and the result was a systematic assault on the palace's spiritual defenses. Areas that had been secure suddenly became warp-saturated zones where reality itself became unreliable. Corridors would twist and change, leading defenders into traps or dead ends that hadn't existed moments before. Rooms would shift between dimensions, vanishing from real space entirely and taking anyone inside with them. The very architecture of the palace began to betray its inhabitants. Malcador the Sigillite fought this psychic assault with every ounce of his considerable power, but he was paying a terrible price. The ancient regent had been old before the emperor even began his conquest of Terra, sustained through the millennia by his psychic might. Now, cut off from the emperor who labored in his sanctum, Malcador was burning through his own life force to maintain the palace's psychic defenses.
He grew visibly frailer with each passing day, his skin becoming translucent, his body shrinking as the power he wielded consumed him from within. Those close to him knew he was dying, sacrificing himself one day at a time to buy Terra more time. But Malcador never complained, never asked for relief. He had served the emperor for longer than anyone could remember, and he would serve unto death and beyond if necessary. The arrival of the traitor legion known as the Thousand Suns added a new dimension to the psychic warfare. These space marines, sorcerers all, had been damned by their own curiosity and hubris, their flesh transmuted into living armor inhabited by their spirits through the machinations of their patron god Sinch. Led by their primarch Magnus the Red, himself a being of immense psychic power who had once been loyal but had been driven into the traitor camp by a combination of circumstance and betrayal, the Thousand Suns brought arcane might to bear against the palace's defenses. They cast great rituals that weakened the walls between worlds, allowing more demons to manifest. They dueled with the loyalist librarians in psychic battles that took place on planes of existence beyond mortal comprehension. And Magnus himself, now ascended to demonhood, became a focus of Tsinch's will, a conduit through which the Changer of Ways could work his schemes upon Terra. Magnus had not wanted this war. He had tried to warn the emperor about Horus's betrayal, but in doing so he had committed his own betrayal, using sorcery that the emperor had forbidden, breaching the psychic defenses of the Imperial Palace, and inadvertently damaging the great work the emperor had been conducting in his sanctum. For this, he had been censured, his legion broken, his world of Prospero destroyed by the space wolves who served as the emperor's executioners. Driven by this injustice, real or perceived, Magnus had thrown in his lot with Horus, though he had always maintained that he was fighting against the emperor's hypocrisy rather than against the emperor himself. Now, standing before the walls of the Imperial Palace, Magnus faced the consequences of his choices. He had become everything his father had warned against, a daemon prince bound to the service of chaos, and there could be no redemption for him now. The psychic duel between Magnus and the combined might of the palace's loyalist psychers was a battle fought on multiple levels of reality simultaneously. In the Materium, it manifested as lightning storms that erupted from clear skies, as reality distortions that made the air shimmer and twist, as sudden manifestations of impossible geometries that hurt the eyes to look upon. In the warp, it was a titanic struggle of wills, vast powers clashing in a realm where thought and reality were one and the same. Magnus, empowered by Tsinch, was immensely strong, capable of feats that would have destroyed lesser psychers. He unraveled the defenses of entire sections of the palace with gestures, transformed loyalist psychers into mindless spawn with a word, cast bolts of warp fire that could vaporize tanks. But he faced not just individual opponents, but a coordinated defense organized by Malcador, and the old Sigillet was still the second most powerful psyker in the Imperium. The defenders suffered terribly from this psychic warfare. Entire companies of soldiers went mad when caught in the periphery of Magnus's attention, clawing at their own faces, attacking their comrades, or simply collapsing into catatonia. Psychers who tried to oppose the Thousand Suns often died horribly, their bodies consumed by the power they channeled, or worse, transformed into portals through which demons could emerge. The Sisters of Silence, an organization of psychic blanks whose very presence negated warp power, were deployed to counter the Thousand Suns, and they proved effective. But there were too few of them and too many sorcerers. The null field they projected could shut down a Psyker's power, but it also affected Loyalist Psykers, making coordination difficult. Still, they persevered. These women who had sacrificed their voices in service to the Imperium, fighting against horrors that made even Space Marines hesitate. In orbit, the space battle continued unabated. The Loyalist fleet had been ground down over the months of fighting, losing ships faster than they could be replaced. The traitor fleet, while also suffering heavy losses, had reinforcements arriving through the warp corridor that Chaos had opened, replacing destroyed vessels faster than the Loyalists could destroy them. Admiral Sukasin, who had commanded the orbital defense with such skill, finally died when her flagship was boarded by Emperor's children, and she chose to detonate the ship's reactor rather than allow it to be captured. Her death was a blow to morale. She had been a rock of stability, a sign that mere mortals could stand alongside the Space Marines in this war. But her sacrifice took several traitor ships with her when her flagship exploded, so she at least died as she had lived, fighting to the last. The orbital situation grew so desperate that the defenders began using increasingly desperate tactics. Ships too damaged to fight were rigged with explosives and set on collision courses with traitor vessels, their skeleton crews staying aboard until the last possible moment before evacuating. Orbital defense platforms that could no longer be held were deliberately detonated to deny them to the enemy. At one point, an entire Loyalist battle group conducted a suicide run directly into the heart of the traitor fleet, their ships blazing away with every weapon they had, hoping to reach and destroy the Vengeful Spirit itself. They failed. Horus's flagship was too well protected, its defenses too strong. But they managed to inflict significant damage on the ships guarding it before they were destroyed. The loss of that battle group left a gap in the orbital defenses that the traitors immediately exploited, allowing them to land even more troops and equipment on the surface. On the ground, the fighting had taken on a nightmarish quality. No one had rest anymore. Soldiers fought until they collapsed from exhaustion, were given a few hours to recover, then sent back to the front. The smell of death pervaded everything, so thick that even sealed armor couldn't keep it out. Bodies lay everywhere, Loyalist and traitor alike, too numerous to recover or bury. In some areas, the dead were stacked like cordwood to form additional defensive barriers. The ground itself had been transformed by the constant bombardment. What had once been the ordered streets and buildings of Terra's greatest city were now a cratered wasteland that resembled nothing so much as the surface of a dead moon. Fires burned everywhere. Some started by weapons fire, others by broken gas lines or electrical systems, filling the air with smoke so thick that visibility was measured in meters, even in broad daylight. The defenders' desperation was such that they began deploying weapons that had been locked away since the age of strife, forbidden technologies that the Emperor himself had ordered destroyed, rad weapons that bathed entire areas in lethal radiation, killing everything, Loyalist and traitor alike, and leaving zones that would be uninhabitable for centuries. Volkite weapons whose heat rays could reduce a man to ash in seconds. Conversion beamers that translated matter directly into energy, leaving nothing behind but a crater of glass. Vortex weapons that tore holes into the warp, creating miniature warp storms that consumed everything they touched before collapsing back on themselves. These weapons were effective, but they were also indiscriminate and dangerous to use, as likely to harm the defenders as the attackers. Still, the situation was desperate enough that the risk was deemed acceptable. The traitors deployed their own forbidden weapons. The Death Guard released tailored plagues that transformed living humans into shambling plague zombies in a matter of hours. The Emperor's children deployed sonic weapons that liquefied internal organs and drove those who heard them mad with agony. The Word-Bearers conducted dark rituals that summoned demonic entities of such power that even other traitor Space Marines feared them.
The Night Lords took prisoners and tortured them within sight and sound of the defenders, their screams broadcast over vox channels as psychological warfare. The war had descended beyond brutality into something that could only be described as a methodical attempt to destroy not just the defenders, but their very souls. As the siege stretched into its 7th month, an event occurred that would prove to be the turning point, though none recognized it at the time. Horus, standing on the bridge of the Vengeful Spirit, received a message from his fleet commanders. Long-range augurs had detected massive warp disturbances at the edge of the system, signs consistent with large fleets translating from the warp. It could only mean one thing: the Loyalist reinforcements were finally arriving. Robuta Guilliman and the Ultramarines, Leman Russ and the Space Wolves, the Lion and the Dark Angels, after months of fighting through warp storms, they were here.
They were still days away, even at maximum acceleration, but they were coming, and when they arrived, Horus would be caught between the defenders and the reinforcements, his numerical advantage neutralized. The War Master faced a choice. He could lift the siege and try to fight the approaching fleets in space, where he still had numerical superiority. Or he could push harder, try to break through the palace's defenses and achieve victory before the reinforcements arrived. Perturabo and the other traitor Primarchs urged caution. They had Terra under siege. Let the Loyalists come to them, force them to be the ones conducting an assault. But Horus knew something they did not. The Chaos Gods had shown him visions, had whispered to him that his fate and the Emperor's would be decided not on the walls or in space, but in personal combat. If he could confront the Emperor directly, if he could prove that the son had surpassed the father, then the war would be won regardless of how many Loyalist fleets arrived. Horus made his decision. He would lower the void shields of the Vengeful Spirit, deliberately making his flagship vulnerable. The Emperor would sense this, would recognize it as the trap it was, but would have no choice but to respond. He could not pass up the opportunity to end the war by striking at its leader. The Emperor would teleport aboard with whatever forces he could muster, and there, on the bridge of the Vengeful Spirit, the two would face each other. It was a gamble of cosmic proportions, but Horus had been blessed by all 4 Chaos Gods. He was more than he had been, more than any Primarch had ever been. He believed, truly believed, that he could defeat his father and claim the Imperium for himself. The order was given. The Vengeful Spirit's void shields began to cycle down. On Terra, in the depths of the Imperial Palace, the Emperor's attention was drawn from his great work. He felt the trap being set, understood what Horus was offering, a direct confrontation that would decide everything. After months of laboring in his sanctum, the Emperor emerged. He was thinner than he had been, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with an inner fire that had not dimmed. He called for his custodian guard, for his most trusted warriors. He called for Rogel Dorn and for Sanguinius. They would teleport to the Vengeful Spirit, would fight through whatever forces Horus had placed in their path, and would end this war once and for all. Malkador came to see the Emperor before he departed. The old Sigillite looked like a living corpse. His skin stretched tight over his bones, his hands trembling with the effort of simply standing. He had held the psychic defenses of Terra for 7 months, and it had cost him everything. The Emperor embraced his oldest friend, knowing that they would not see each other again. There were no words exchanged. After so many millennia together, words were unnecessary. Malkador understood what was required of him. When the Emperor left Terra, someone would need to sit upon the Golden Throne, the great psychic amplifier that powered the Astronomicon and held back the Daemon Tides. The Emperor could not do both. He could not fight Horus and maintain the defenses of Terra.
so Malcador would take his place, would sit upon the throne and burn the last of his life to give the emperor the time he needed. It was a death sentence, and both of them knew it, but Malcador accepted it without hesitation. He had served for longer than civilizations endured, and this would be his final service. The emperor gathered his forces, 100 custodian guard, the finest warriors humanity had ever produced. Rogel Dorn, lord of the Imperial Fists, would be at his side. And Sanguinius, the angel, would fly with them, knowing that this was the moment his visions had shown him, the moment of his death. The Blood Angel's Primarch had told no one, but he knew he would not return from the Vengeful Spirit. He had seen his own corpse, broken and bloody, laid at Horus's feet. But he went anyway, because that was what duty demanded, and because his death might buy the Emperor the precious seconds needed for victory. The small strike force gathered in a teleportarium, ancient technology that could transmit matter through the warp over vast distances. It was risky at the best of times, and with the warp as turbulent as it was now, the chances of arriving intact were far from certain. But time was critical. Every moment they delayed was another moment for Horus to reconsider and raise his shields. The teleportation was catastrophic. The warp was too disturbed, too charged with malevolent energy. The strike force scattered, some appearing in the wrong parts of the Vengeful Spirit, others lost in the warp entirely, their matter dispersed across dimensions and time. The Emperor himself materialized intact, but he found himself deep in the bowels of the flagship, far from the bridge where Horus waited. Sanguinius appeared nearby, his wings folded, his face set in grim determination. But Rogel Dorn and most of the custodians had been scattered. Some appeared in correct locations, others in lethal environments where they died instantly, vented into space, or materialized inside solid walls. The carefully planned strike had become a desperate scramble, the advantage of surprise lost in the chaos of arrival. The interior of the Vengeful Spirit was a nightmare made manifest. The ship had once been a masterpiece of Imperial construction, a symbol of humanity's mastery of technology and the void. Now it was a temple to chaos. Its corridors twisted into impossible geometries, its walls covered in blasphemous symbols that hurt to look at, its very atmosphere thick with warp energy. Daemons cavorted in the corridors, while corrupted crew went about their duties with the mindless dedication of the damned. The Emperor and Sanguinius began to fight their way toward the bridge, cutting down any who stood in their way. The Emperor wielded the Sword of the Emperor, a blade of pure psychic fire that had no physical form, but could cut through any defense. Every swing destroyed not just the body, but the soul of his opponents, erasing traitors and demons alike from existence. Sanguinius fought at his side, his blade and bolter working in perfect concert. The Primarch moved with a grace that seemed impossible for a being of his size, his wings carrying him through the air in swift attacks before he landed to engage in close combat. Together, they carved a path of destruction through the ship, leaving a trail of corpses and banished demons in their wake. But the ship itself fought against them. Corridors that led toward the bridge would suddenly twist to lead elsewhere. Doors would seal themselves. Gravity would shift without warning. The Vengeful Spirit was alive in a way no ship should be, possessed by something vast and malevolent that served Horus's will. Elsewhere in the ship, Rogel Dorn materialized with a handful of custodians. They found themselves in one of the ship's armories, surrounded by corrupted weapons and ammunition. They immediately began fighting their way toward where they hoped the Emperor would be, but the ship fought them at every turn. Wave after wave of traitor space marines and cultists poured into the corridors to stop them. Dorn fought with mechanical efficiency, his chainsword never still, his bolter barking as he led his small force deeper into the ship. Every step was contested, every corridor a battlefield. The custodians fell one by one, each selling their life dearly, but ultimately overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Dorn knew he was unlikely to reach the bridge in time, but he fought on anyway, because surrender was not in his nature. The Emperor and Sanguinius finally reached a great vaulted chamber that had once been a cathedral to the imperial truth, but was now a temple to chaos. Here they faced their first true test. 3 greater demons, one of Khorne, one of Nurgle, and one of Tzeentch, manifested in their full power, sent by their dark masters to delay the Emperor. These were not the lesser entities that had been appearing throughout the siege, but the mightiest servants of the Chaos Gods short of the gods themselves. The Bloodthirster towered 4 stories tall, its brass skin glowing with heat, its great axe crackling with killing power. The Great Unclean One was a mountain of rotting flesh, its very presence spreading disease and decay. The Lord of Change was a being of impossible beauty and horror combined, its form shifting constantly, its magic warping reality around it. The battle that followed was on a scale rarely seen in all of human history. The Emperor fought all 3 demons simultaneously, his psychic might blazing like a star, each gesture destroying portions of reality as he unmade the demons' forms. But these were not mere demons, these were aspects of the dark gods themselves, and they reformed as fast as he could destroy them.
Sanguinius engaged the Bloodthirster in single combat, his blade meeting the daemon's axe in a shower of sparks. The Primarch fought with desperate fury, knowing that every second he could hold this horror was another second for the Emperor to reach Horus. His blade found gaps in the daemon's brass armor, drawing ichor that burned like acid. The Bloodthirster's axe carved furrows in his armor, wounds that would have killed a normal space marine, but which the Primarch's enhanced biology managed to endure. The Emperor finally unleashed the full measure of his psychic might, a blast of pure will that tore the 3 greater daemons apart on a fundamental level, scattering their essence back to the warp from whence they came. The effort cost him, such power was taxing even for him, but the way was clear. He and Sanguinius pressed on, ascending through the ship toward the bridge. They could feel Horus's presence ahead of them, a psychic beacon of corruption and power that drew them forward like moths to a flame. The crew and defenders they encountered now fled rather than fight. Even corrupted as they were, they recognized that nothing could stand against the Emperor and the Angel together. Finally, they reached the doors to the bridge. These were massive adamantium barriers that could withstand battleship weapons, sealed shut and protected by every ward and protection Horus had been able to summon. But the Emperor simply raised his hand, and the doors exploded inward, torn from their hinges by psychic force. Beyond lay the bridge of the Vengeful Spirit, and on its command throne sat Horus. The War Master rose to greet his father and his brother, and the sight of him was terrible. He had once been the most beautiful of the Primarchs, noble and handsome, a warrior king out of legend. Now he was a monster, his body swollen with chaos power, his armor fused to his flesh, his eyes burning with the malevolence of the 4 dark gods. He stood 3 meters tall, dwarfing even other Primarchs, and the air around him crackled with barely restrained power. Sanguinius stepped forward, placing himself between the Emperor and Horus. The Angel knew his role in this drama. He had seen it in his visions. He would face Horus first, would wound him, would weaken him enough that the Emperor would have a chance at victory. But it would cost Sanguinius everything. He looked back at the Emperor one last time, his eyes conveying all the things he could not say, then turned to face his fallen brother. Horus laughed,
a sound that echoed with the voice of demons. He recognized Sanguinius's intent, understood the sacrifice that was being offered, and it amused him. Did they truly think that one Primarch could stand against him, blessed as he was by all 4 Chaos gods? He was more than a Primarch now, more than anything the Emperor had created. He was the avatar of chaos itself. The duel between Sanguinius and Horus was brief and brutal.
The angel attacked with all his skill, his blade seeking the weak points in Horus's defenses, his wings carrying him through attacks from multiple angles. He fought like he had never fought before, driven by desperation and determination, knowing that this was the most important battle of his life, even though it would also be his last. He actually managed to wound Horus. His blessed blade penetrated the War Master's armor and drew blood, black and smoking. For a moment, just a moment, he thought he might actually prevail. Then Horus caught him by the throat with one massive hand, lifting him into the air. Sanguinius struggled, his wings beating frantically, but Horus's grip was like iron. The War Master smiled, a terrible expression on his corrupted face, and then he tore Sanguinius in half. The Emperor screamed, a psychic cry of anguish that resonated through the warp, felt by every psyker in the galaxy. His most beloved son, the most noble of all his creations, murdered before his eyes. Rage filled him, a rage that he had kept controlled for millennia, the rage of a father who has watched his son kill another of his sons. He advanced on Horus, his sword blazing with psychic fire. The War Master dropped Sanguinius's broken body and faced his father, ready for the final confrontation. This was the moment he had worked toward for 7 years, the moment when he would prove that he had surpassed his creator, that the student had become greater than the master. Around them, the bridge of the Vengeful Spirit seemed to fade away, replaced by a realm that existed between reality and the warp, a space where their true power could be unleashed without constraint. The battle between the Emperor and Horus was fought on multiple planes of existence simultaneously. In the material realm, they clashed with weapons that could shatter continents. In the warp, they dueled with psychic might that reshaped reality around them. Every blow Horus struck was empowered by the Chaos Gods, carrying with it not just physical force, but spiritual corruption. Every parry from the Emperor was an act of will, denying the Dark Gods their victory. They moved faster than the eye could follow, their weapons meeting in showers of sparks, each exchange of blows lasting microseconds, but containing within it the potential to decide the fate of the galaxy. Horus was stronger than the Emperor had anticipated. The blessings of all 4 Chaos Gods made him a match for his father in ways that should not have been possible. His strength was enhanced beyond measure, his speed incredible, his resilience seemingly without limit. He wielded his weapon, a massive power mace called Worldbreaker, with devastating effect, each swing capable of crushing battle tanks. He channeled warp powers through himself, hurling bolts of corrupted energy that the Emperor had to deflect with his own psychic might. And worst of all, every blow he landed carried with it a spiritual taint that began to corrupt even the Emperor's transcendent form. This was what the Chaos Gods had been working toward, not just to kill the Emperor, but to corrupt him, to make him serve them as Horus now served. The Emperor fought back with all his considerable might, but he was holding back. Even now, even facing his traitorous son, he could not bring himself to use his full power. Some part of him still hoped that Horus could be redeemed, that the son he had loved so much might still be in there somewhere, fighting against the corruption that had claimed him. So he held back, tried to subdue rather than destroy. And Horus exploited that hesitation ruthlessly.
The War Master's power mace caught the Emperor in the chest, cracking his armor, breaking ribs, sending him staggering backward. Another blow shattered his left arm. A third caught him in the head, fracturing his skull, driving him to his knees. Horus stood over the fallen emperor, savoring his victory. He had done it. He had actually defeated the emperor of mankind, had proven himself the superior being. The Chaos Gods whispered in his mind, urging him to finish it, to kill his father and claim the Imperium for chaos. But Horus wanted to savor this moment, wanted his father to understand that he had lost. He reached down and tore away the Emperor's armor, exposing his chest, ready to strike the killing blow. It was in this moment of triumph that a single human, a simple Imperial army soldier who had somehow made his way to the bridge, attacked Horus from behind. The man's weapon couldn't possibly harm a being as powerful as Horus, but the act of defiance itself was meaningful. Here was a mortal, insignificant in the cosmic scale, willing to throw his life away in a futile attempt to protect the Emperor. Horus turned and killed the soldier casually, erasing him from existence with a gesture. And in that moment, seeing a mere human destroyed so carelessly, seeing the contempt with which Horus treated the life of those he had once sworn to protect, the Emperor finally understood that his son was truly gone. The Horus he had loved, the noble war master who had led the Great Crusade, was dead, consumed by the chaos corruption. What stood before him now was merely a shell, a puppet dancing to the tune of the dark gods. And with that understanding came the release of the Emperor's restraint. If his son was truly gone, then he could finally do what he needed to do. The Emperor rose to his feet, his broken body knitting itself back together through sheer force of will. His psychic might, no longer held in check, began to manifest in ways that defied description. The warp itself bent around him, reality becoming fluid in his presence. When he looked at Horus now, it was with eyes that saw through all illusions, all lies, all corruption. He saw the four chaos gods puppeting his son's form, saw the threads of power they had woven through him, saw the truth of what Horus had become. And with a gesture, he reached into Horus's soul and began to unmake the corruption that had claimed him. The psychic assault was on a scale that beggared belief. The Emperor poured his full power into Horus, burning away the chaos taint, destroying the blessings of the dark gods, stripping away every gift and enhancement until only the original Primarch remained. Horus screamed, a sound of pure agony that echoed through the warp as he felt himself being burned clean. For just a moment, a single moment of clarity, the real Horus returned. He looked at what he had done, at the death and destruction he had caused, at the brother he had murdered, at the father he had betrayed. The horror and remorse were total and crushing. He begged his father for forgiveness, but even as the words left his lips, the Emperor delivered the final blow. The Emperor's psychic might burned through Horus like a solar flare, not just killing his body, but destroying his very soul. There could be no mercy here, no half measures. If even a fragment of Horus's soul survived, the Chaos Gods might be able to resurrect him, and this nightmare would begin anew. So the Emperor erased his son from existence, burning away every trace of what Horus had been, until nothing remained but an empty shell. The body of the War Master fell to the deck, no longer corrupted, no longer powerful, just the corpse of what had once been the greatest of the Primarchs. The Emperor stood over it, his own body broken and bleeding, and wept for what he had lost. Rogel Dorn finally reached the bridge with the last surviving members of his force. He found the Emperor kneeling beside Sanguinius' broken body, tears streaming down his face. The sight of the Emperor weeping was something Dorn had never seen before, something he had not thought possible. The Lord of the Imperial Fists took in the scene. The dead Horus, the slain Sanguinius, the Emperor grievously wounded, and understood that they had won, but at a terrible cost. He immediately began organizing the evacuation, calling for every functional teleporter on Terra to lock onto their location. Knowing that the Vengeful Spirit's crew would soon realize what had happened and would converge on this location in force. The teleportation back to Terra was difficult, but not as catastrophic as the initial insertion had been. The Emperor was transported directly to the Imperial Palace, to the golden throne that Malcador had been holding for him. The old sigillite still sat upon the throne, though he was little more than a desiccated husk by now, having burned almost all of his life force to maintain the psychic defenses in the Emperor's absence. When the Emperor returned and took his place on the throne, Malcador slumped forward, his task finally complete.
The Emperor caught his oldest friend, cradled him gently, and Malcador spoke his final words. "It is done, my lord. The Imperium stands." Then he crumbled to dust, his life entirely spent. The Emperor sat upon the golden throne and wept for the second friend he had lost that day. The death of Horus changed everything. The traitor forces, which had been pressing hard on every front, suddenly found themselves without their unifying leader. The Primarchs who remained began to bicker among themselves, each claiming the right to lead. The demons, no longer held in check by Horus's will and the blessings of the Chaos Gods that had focused on him, began to turn on the traitor Space Marines themselves. The assault on the Imperial Palace faltered as the traitors fell into confusion and disarray. Rogel Dorn, seizing the moment, ordered a general counterattack. The defenders, who had been holding on by their fingernails, suddenly found themselves on the offensive, pushing the traitors back from positions they had held for months. The arrival of the Loyalist relief fleets completed the rout. Robot Guilliman and the Ultramarines, Leman Russ and the Space Wolves, the Lion and the Dark Angels, they crashed into the traitor fleet with devastating force. The traitors, caught between the orbital defenses and the arriving Loyalists, were crushed. Ship after ship was destroyed, their crews either killed or forced to flee into the warp. The remaining traitor Primarchs, seeing that the battle was lost, ordered a general retreat. They would withdraw to the Eye of Terror, that great warp storm where the barrier between real space and the Imperium had collapsed entirely, and from there continue their long war against the Imperium. But Terra was saved, the Emperor had prevailed, and humanity would endure. But the victory was Pyrrhic in the extreme. The Emperor, grievously wounded by his battle with Horus, could not leave the Golden Throne. His body, though immortal, had been damaged beyond even his ability to heal while maintaining the psychic defenses necessary to protect Terra and power the Astronomicon. He would have to remain on the throne for the foreseeable future, perhaps forever, neither truly alive nor truly dead, sustained by the sacrifice of thousands of psychers whose souls would be fed to the throne to maintain his existence. He could no longer lead the Imperium directly, no longer guide humanity with his physical presence. He had become, in effect, exactly what he had always denied being, a god, distant and unknowable, worshipped but never seen. The cost in lives was almost incomprehensible. Billions had died in the Siege of Terra. Entire sections of the Imperial Palace had been destroyed and would take decades to rebuild. The gene seed stocks of several Loyalist legions had been devastated. The Blood Angels had lost their Primarch. The Imperial Fists were bled white, the white scars reduced to a shadow of their former strength.
The civilian population of Terra, those who had survived, were traumatized beyond measure, an entire generation scarred by what they had witnessed.
The Imperium itself would never be the same. The dream of a secular, rational empire of science and reason had died in the flames of the siege, replaced by the fanatical religiosity of the imperial cult that worshipped the emperor as a god. The immediate aftermath of the siege saw a frenzy of activity as the defenders worked to secure their victory and rebuild what had been destroyed. The traitor forces still on Terra were hunted down mercilessly, given no quarter, shown no mercy. Those who tried to surrender were executed on the spot. There could be no forgiveness for those who had betrayed the Imperium so completely. The cultist populations who had supported the traitors were purged with fire and blade, entire hive sections sterilized to ensure no taint of chaos remained. It was brutal, it was excessive, but in the minds of those who had survived the siege, it was necessary. They had seen what chaos could do, had witnessed the corruption it spread, and they were determined that it would never gain such a foothold on Terra again. Rogel Dorn took command of the Imperium's military forces in the Emperor's absence, organizing the Great Scouring, a campaign to hunt down the remaining traitor forces and drive them from Imperial space. It would take 7 more years of brutal warfare before the last traitor legion was forced to retreat into the Eye of Terror. 7 more years of battles and sieges and desperate last stands. But the outcome was never in doubt. The Loyalists had won on Terra, and they would complete that victory across the galaxy. The traitor Primarchs who had fled would become legends of horror, demon princes who would raid and pillage from their warp-cursed refuge, but who would never again threaten the Imperium's existence as they had during the heresy. The Emperor's internment on the Golden Throne marked a fundamental shift in how the Imperium functioned. Where before he had been an active, hands-on ruler who could directly intervene in events across the galaxy, now he could only watch and occasionally provide guidance through dreams and visions to those few psychers strong enough to receive them. Practical governance of the Imperium fell to others. Robot Guilliman would organize the bureaucracy and write the Codex Astartes that would govern the Space Marines for 10,000 years to come. Rogel Dorn would fortify Terra to ensure it could never again be threatened as it had been. The other Loyalist Primarchs would scatter across the galaxy, each dealing with the aftermath in their own way, and gradually, one by one, they would disappear, lost to death or fate or madness, until none remained, and the Imperium was ruled by ordinary humans claiming to act in the Emperor's name. The Siege of Terra became the defining moment of the Imperium's history, the point at which everything changed. The optimism and hope of the Great Crusade was replaced by paranoia and fear. The Emperor's vision of a rational, atheistic empire was replaced by the imperial creed that proclaimed him a god. The Emperor's internment on the Golden Throne marked a fundamental shift in how the Imperium functioned. Where before he had been an active, hands-on ruler who could directly intervene in events across the galaxy, now he could only watch and occasionally provide guidance through dreams and visions to those few psychers strong enough to receive them. Practical governance of the Imperium fell to others. Robot Guilliman would organize the bureaucracy and write the Codex Astartes that would govern the Space Marines for 10,000 years to come. Rogel Dorn would fortify Terra to ensure it could never again be threatened as it had been. The other Loyalist Primarchs would scatter across the galaxy, each dealing with the aftermath in their own way, and gradually, one by one, they would disappear, lost to death or fate or madness, until none remained, and the Imperium was ruled by ordinary humans claiming to act in the Emperor's name.
The Siege of Terra became the defining moment of the Imperium's history, the point at which everything changed. The optimism and hope of the Great Crusade was replaced by paranoia and fear. The Emperor's vision of a rational, atheistic empire was replaced by the imperial creed that proclaimed him a god.
The unified Space Marine legions were broken down into smaller chapters to prevent any future betrayal on the scale of the heresy. The Inquisition was founded to hunt out heresy and corruption wherever it might hide. The Imperium became harder, more brutal, more authoritarian, but it survived, and in the grim darkness of the far future, survival was the only victory that mattered. The bodies of the fallen were honored according to their deeds. Sanguinius was laid to rest in a magnificent tomb on Terra, his sacrifice remembered and revered by his legion and the Imperium at large. The Blood Angels would forever after carry the memory of their Primarch's death. It would manifest in their gene seed as the Black Rage, a curse that would sometimes cause them to relive Sanguinius's final moments, fighting and dying as he had died. It was a terrible price, but they bore it willingly as a reminder of what their father had sacrificed for the Imperium. Malcador the Sigillite had no body to honor, having been reduced to dust by his efforts. But his name was spoken with reverence by all who knew what he had done, holding the throne so the Emperor could face Horus. The traitor dead were treated with less honor. Horus's body was completely destroyed, broken down to the molecular level and scattered, ensuring that no relic of his corpse could become a focus for chaos worship. The bodies of traitor space marines were burned en masse, their armor and weapons melted down and reforged into monuments to the loyalist dead. The traitor titans that had been destroyed were torn apart, their machine spirits exorcised, their components either destroyed or so thoroughly purified that no trace of corruption remained. Nothing was left that might serve as a connection to the dark powers that had driven the traitors to such evil. The palace itself bore the scars of the siege for decades afterward. Some sections were so badly damaged that they were simply sealed off and abandoned, their corridors left empty and dark, haunted by the ghosts of those who had died defending them. Other sections were rebuilt, but always with the knowledge of what had happened there, always with a sense of somber remembrance. The walls where the fiercest fighting had occurred were preserved as they were, the pockmarks from bolter rounds and last fire left unrepaired as a reminder of the price of survival. Memorials were erected throughout the palace, naming the units and individuals who had given their lives in the defense of Terra. Though there were so many dead that recording all their names would have required entire buildings dedicated to nothing else. For the survivors, the psychological impact of the siege would never fully heal. Space Marines who had fought through the entire 7 months would wake screaming from nightmares decades later, reliving the horror of battles they had thought long behind them. Imperial Army soldiers who survived would find themselves unable to readjust to civilian life, the horrors they had witnessed having forever changed them. The civilians who had endured the siege in the shelters emerged into a world that was simultaneously their home and utterly alien. Familiar locations transformed into ruins, familiar faces gone forever. Many simply gave up, unable to find the will to continue living in a world so thoroughly scarred. Others threw themselves into the work of rebuilding with manic energy, desperate to create something new from the ruins, to prove that humanity could endure even the worst that the galaxy could throw at it. The Siege of Terra entered Imperial mythology as the darkest hour, the moment when everything hung in the balance and humanity nearly lost everything. It was taught in the Schola Progenium, where future officers and administrators learned about the price of treachery and the importance of loyalty. It was preached about in the imperial churches, where the emperor's sacrifice was held up as the ultimate example of what a leader should be willing to give for his people. It was studied by military commanders who analyzed the tactics and strategies employed by both sides, learning from the successes and failures of those who had fought on the walls.
And it was remembered by the Space Marines, who carried the legacy of the siege in their very gene seed, a physical reminder of the brothers who had fallen and the duty that had been fulfilled. The strategic lessons of the siege were profound. The importance of defense in depth was proven beyond any doubt. The multiple layers of fortifications had bought precious time, forcing the traitors to fight for every meter of ground. The value of combined arms operations was demonstrated repeatedly, with the most successful defensive actions being those where Space Marines, Imperial Army, and Mechanicum forces worked together seamlessly. The necessity of maintaining reserves was shown by how often a critical position was saved by the timely arrival of fresh forces. And perhaps most importantly, the siege demonstrated that even the most overwhelming assault could be defeated if the defenders had the will to continue fighting, that morale and determination mattered as much as weapons and armor. The technological innovations forced by the siege would influence imperial warfare for millennia to come. New patterns of fortifications were developed based on what had worked and what had failed on Terra. Weapon systems that had proven effective were put into mass production. Tactics for fighting chaos-corrupted forces were codified and disseminated throughout the Imperium. The experience of fighting demons and warp-touched enemies led to the development of specialized equipment and training for those who would face such foes in the future. In a sense, the Siege of Terra became the template for all future Imperial defensive doctrine, the standard against which all other sieges would be measured. The fate of the traitor legions after Terra varied. Some, like the Iron Warriors, remained relatively cohesive, conducting campaigns of spite and hatred against the Imperium from within the Eye of Terror. Others, like the World Eaters, fragmented into scattered warbands, each following its own path of destruction.
The Death Guard became plague fleets, spreading Nurgle's gifts wherever they went. The Emperor's children descended into pure hedonism, seeking only the most extreme sensations. The Thousand Sons became little more than dust animated by sorcery, their physical forms destroyed by the very magic they had sought to master. All would continue to threaten the Imperium, raiding out of the Eye of Terror in what became known as the Long War. But never again would they come so close to victory as they had on Terra. The Loyalist legions, too, were changed by the siege. The Imperial Fists, having bled so heavily in the defense of Terra, would take on the role of the Emperor's Praetorians, eternally vigilant against any threat to the throne world. The Blood Angels would carry the curse of the Black Rage, but also a nobility and artistry that honored their fallen Primarch. The White Scars would continue their lightning warfare, but with a new appreciation for the value of fortification and defense. The Space Wolves, having missed the final battle, would dedicate themselves to hunting the traitors wherever they hid. Each legion's experience of the heresy and the siege shaped their character for the 10,000 years that followed. The common citizens of the Imperium, those who had not been on Terra during the siege, learned of these events through propaganda and legend rather than direct experience. The truth of what had happened was often sanitized or mythologized. The full horror of the demonic incursions was downplayed, the scale of the casualties minimized, the doubts and moments of despair transformed into tales of unwavering faith and determination. This was deliberate policy by the new imperial government, which recognized that the full truth might be too much for many to bear, that it might inspire despair rather than hope. So, the Siege of Terra entered popular consciousness as a great victory rather than a narrow escape from total annihilation, a glorious triumph rather than a Pyrrhic disaster. But those who had been there knew the truth. They knew how close it had come, knew that if a handful of decisions had gone differently, if the Emperor had delayed even a few hours more before teleporting to the Vengeful Spirit, if Sanguinius had not been willing to sacrifice himself, if Rogel Dorn had not prepared the defenses with such thoroughness,
then Terra would have fallen, and humanity would have been lost to chaos. They knew that the victory had not been inevitable, that it had been bought with rivers of blood and mountains of corpses, that it had required sacrifices that could never be truly repaid. And they knew that the Emperor had given everything, had consigned himself to an eternity of torment on the Golden Throne to ensure that humanity survived. The Golden Throne itself became the center of the Imperium's existence. Every day, thousands of Psykers were sacrificed to power it, their souls consumed to sustain the Emperor's fading life force and maintain the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that made warp travel possible.
It was a terrible price, but the alternative was worse. If the Emperor died, the throne failed, and the Astronomicon went out, the Imperium would fragment, losing the ability to travel between stars, and humanity would be easy prey for the Xenos and Chaos forces that surrounded it. So the sacrifices continued, day after day, year after year, millennium after millennium, each Psyker giving their life so that the Emperor might endure one more day and the Imperium might survive. The legend of the Emperor sitting upon the Golden Throne, neither alive nor dead, watching over humanity, became central to the Imperial Creed. He was portrayed as suffering willingly for his people, enduring endless torment so that they might live in relative safety. This martyrdom was held up as the ultimate example of what it meant to serve the Imperium, that one's own suffering was meaningless compared to the greater good of humanity, that duty required sacrifice without complaint, that to give everything, including one's life, was the highest calling. It was a dark faith, born from dark times, but it served to unite the Imperium and give it purpose in a galaxy that offered nothing but war and death. 10,000 years later, the Imperium still stands, though it is a pale shadow of what the Emperor had envisioned during the Great Crusade. It is a theocracy where he is worshipped as a god despite his own wishes. It is bureaucratic and hidebound, resistant to change, suspicious of innovation. It is brutal and totalitarian, crushing any dissent with extreme prejudice. But it endures. Humanity has survived 10 millennia of constant warfare, has held back the darkness, has maintained its existence against impossible odds. And at the heart of that endurance is the sacrifice made during the Siege of Terra, the Emperor giving up his freedom and almost his life, Sanguinius giving everything, Malcador burning himself to nothing, and millions of ordinary humans standing on walls and fighting until they could fight no more. The Siege of Terra was humanity's darkest hour, but it was also its finest. It proved that even when facing extinction, even when confronted with enemies that defied all reason and sanity, humanity could stand and fight. It showed that loyalty and duty were not just empty words, but principles worth dying for. It demonstrated that even in defeat, there could be victory, that the Emperor had lost much, had been forced to sacrifice his dream of a rational empire, but had ensured that humanity survived to dream again. The siege was the pivot point of human history, the moment when one age ended and another began, the crucible in which the Imperium was forged into the form it would hold for 10,000 years. The specific battles that raged during those 7 months became the subject of countless treatises, studied by military academicians and battlefield commanders alike. The defense of the Ultimate Gate, where Sanguinius had stood against an entire legion. The Lion's Gate spaceport, where the first walls fell. The Saturnine Gambit, where betrayal met counter-betrayal. The Eternity Wall, where the Iron Warriors proved they could break any defense if given enough time and resources. Each engagement had its lessons, its heroes, its tragedies. Each added to the tapestry of the siege, the grand and terrible story of how humanity nearly died but chose to live. In the end, the Siege of Terra was about more than tactics and strategy, more than heroes and villains, more than victory and defeat. It was about what it meant to be human in a galaxy that was actively hostile to humanity's existence. It was about the choice between accepting corruption and damnation or standing firm in the face of annihilation. It was about sacrifice, not the glorious sacrifice celebrated in propaganda, but the ugly, grinding sacrifice of watching everything you love be destroyed while you continue to fight because there is no alternative. It was about endurance, about the human capacity to suffer beyond all reasonable limits and still find the strength to take one more step, fire one more shot, hold one more second. The defenders of Terra knew they were probably going to die. They fought anyway. They knew the odds were against them. They fought anyway. They knew that even if they won, the price would be so high that it would destroy the Imperium they were trying to save. They fought anyway, because that is what duty demanded, because that is what honor required, because to surrender to chaos was worse than death. It was the annihilation of everything that made them human. So they stood on the walls, they held the line, they made the traitors pay for every inch of ground, and when they finally fell, they fell knowing that they had given everything they had and it had been enough. The Siege of Terra was humanity's darkest hour, but it was not humanity's last hour. The Imperium survived, the Emperor endured, and humanity continued its eternal war against the darkness, carrying forward the legacy of those who had died on Terra's walls, remembering their sacrifice and honoring it by refusing to surrender no matter what horrors the galaxy might produce. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there is also duty, honor, and the defiant certainty that humanity will endure because humanity refuses to do otherwise. That was the true lesson of the Siege of Terra, and it echoes down through the millennia, inspiring each new generation to stand as their predecessors stood, to fight as their predecessors fought, and to give everything as their predecessors gave everything. For the Emperor, for humanity, for the Imperium that must endure until the stars themselves grow cold and dark. The memory of the siege lives on in countless forms throughout the Imperium. In the reclusium of every Space Marine chapter, where the names of those who fell are inscribed in stone and brass. In the cathedrals of the Imperial Creed, where the story is told and retold, each telling adding new layers of myth and meaning. For the Emperor, for humanity, for the Imperium that must endure until the stars themselves grow cold and dark. The memory of the siege lives on in countless forms throughout the Imperium. In the reclusium of every Space Marine chapter, where the names of those who fell are inscribed in stone and brass. In the cathedrals of the Imperial Creed, where the story is told and retold, each telling adding new layers of myth and meaning. In the training doctrines of the Imperial Guard, where the tactics employed are analyzed and adapted. In the whispered prayers of families whose ancestors fought and died on Terra's walls, their lineage forever marked by that service. In the very structure of the Imperium itself, which was shaped by the aftermath of the siege and the choices made in those desperate days. And perhaps most importantly, the memory lives on in the Emperor himself. Though he cannot speak, cannot move, cannot interact with the physical world in any meaningful way, he sits upon the golden throne and watches. He sees every battle fought in his name, every sacrifice made for the Imperium, every moment of courage and defiance against the darkness. He remembers Sanguinius falling, Malcador burning himself away, Rogel Dorn standing resolute on the walls. He remembers Horus's betrayal and the terrible necessity of destroying his own son. He carries those memories through the endless centuries, and they fuel his determination to continue his vigil, to maintain the Astramacon, to protect humanity for as long as he can. The siege may be over, but the Emperor's battle continues, and will continue until the end of time or the end of humanity, whichever comes first.
The Siege of Terra was the end of hope and the beginning of despair, the death of dreams and the birth of duty, the moment when humanity lost everything except the will to survive. And in that will to survive, in that refusal to surrender even when all seemed lost, humanity found something greater than the Emperor's original vision. It found a purpose that would sustain it through 10,000 years of darkness, not to build paradise, not to achieve enlightenment, but simply to endure, to continue, to ensure that somewhere in the galaxy, humans still existed to raise their fist in defiance against a universe that wanted them gone. That is the legacy of the Siege of Terra. That is why it matters. That is why, 10 millennia later, the Imperium still stands, still fights, still endures. Because those who stood on Terra's walls taught humanity how to survive the unsurvivable, how to endure the unendurable, and how to continue fighting long after any sane species would have surrendered to oblivion.